You ever notice how the loudest man in the room is usually the one who knows the least? The question drifted through the warm afternoon air, spoken by nobody in particular, yet it lingered over the Marine Corps open house like a challenge waiting for an answer. Families moved between equipment displays. Children climbed into parked vehicles under the watchful eyes of proud parents. The distant hum of helicopter rotors blended with laughter, conversation, and the occasional bark of instructions from young Marines assigned to crowd control. It was supposed to be a celebration of service. Instead, near the edge of the aviation exhibit, it was becoming something else entirely. Captain Ryan Mercer stood with his hands on his hips, his crisp uniform immaculate beneath the bright North Carolina sun. At 31, Mercer carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. Around him stood several younger Marines, listening closely as he explained the capabilities of a modern reconnaissance platform parked behind them. They laughed when he joked. They nodded when he spoke. The captain enjoyed being the center of attention. Then he noticed the old man sitting alone on a folding chair just beyond the display barrier. The stranger looked completely out of place. He wore faded khaki pants, worn leather boots, and a weathered green jacket despite the heat. His white hair stirred gently in the breeze. His hands rested quietly on a wooden cane positioned across his knees. He wasn't studying the aircraft. He wasn't taking pictures. He simply sat there, watching the sky. Mercer frowned. "Who's that supposed to be?" he asked. One of the Marines glanced over. "No idea, sir. Looks like somebody's grandfather wandered into the wrong section." A few chuckles followed. The old man never reacted. Mercer started walking toward him. Gravel crunched beneath polished boots. Nearby conversations softened as people sensed tension forming. The captain stopped directly in front of the seated stranger. "Sir," he said, forcing a smile that carried little warmth, "this area is restricted to authorized personnel." The old man slowly shifted his gaze from the clouds to the captain's face. His eyes were pale blue. Calm. Steady. Unusually steady. "I'm aware," he said. His voice was rough with age, but carried an unexpected weight. Mercer waited for an explanation. None came. The silence irritated him immediately. "Then maybe you can explain why you're sitting here." "Just watching." The answer was simple. Too simple. Several Marines behind Mercer exchanged amused looks. The captain let out a short laugh. "Watching what?" The old man looked back toward the sky. "Everything." More laughter. A few visitors smiled awkwardly before moving away. Mercer felt his confidence growing. This was easy. The stranger looked harmless. Just another old veteran clinging to memories nobody cared about anymore. "You know," Mercer said loudly enough for others to hear, "most people come here to learn something." The old man nodded slightly. "That's true. And what exactly are you here to learn?" For the first time, the old man allowed a faint smile to touch the corner of his mouth. "Who still remembers?" The answer landed strangely. Not dramatic. Not confrontational. Just strange enough to make the Marines glance at one another. Mercer quickly brushed the feeling aside. The crowd was growing now. People always slowed down when conflict appeared. The captain straightened his shoulders. "All right, old-timer," he said with a grin that invited the audience to enjoy the joke with him. "Let's see if you remember anything useful at all." Captain Mercer stepped closer, his polished boots crunching on the gravel of the exhibit area, the midday sun reflecting sharply off his badge. His hands flexed at his sides, and the young Marines behind him straightened, sensing the captain's growing irritation. Thomas Walker remained seated, his posture calm, his hands lightly resting on the cane across his knees. The breeze teased the edges of his faded jacket, but he did not flinch. Mercer leaned down slightly, forcing his voice into a tone that was meant to command respect, yet carried a hint of mockery. "Sir, this is a restricted area. I am going to need you to move along or provide some sort of authorization." Thomas's gaze shifted from the horizon to the captain, his pale blue eyes steady, unyielding, almost piercing. "I am authorized," he said softly, almost as if it were a statement to himself. Mercer's lips twitched with impatience. He gestured to the display behind them, the sleek aircraft gleaming in the sunlight. "Look, we are trying to keep this area clear for active personnel demonstrations. You do not belong here right now." There was a pause, a weight settling into the air as spectators from nearby displays slowed their movements, curious eyes turning toward the interaction. Thomas did not respond immediately. He simply sat, absorbing the sunlight, the noise, the faint scent of fuel from the helicopters. Mercer stepped closer, lowering his voice to ensure only the old man and his team could hear. So what exactly brings you here? Are you just here to take pictures? To gawk at the equipment? Thomas's lips curved slightly, the smallest hint of a smile, almost imperceptible. I am here to observe, he said. The words were simple, but the effect was unsettling. Mercer's eyes narrowed. The faint unease from the older Marines behind him began to grow. This man was not reacting the way a visitor should. The silence stretched, heavy and deliberate, forcing Mercer to acknowledge a discomfort he had not expected. He shifted his weight, attempting to regain control. And do you have any identification for me? Something that proves your business here. Thomas slowly reached into his jacket pocket and produced a small, worn leather wallet. He removed a single card, holding it between two fingers with care, allowing it to catch the sunlight for a brief moment before handing it over. Mercer snatched it, inspecting it quickly, his eyes scanning the information with an expression that blended authority and condescension. Very well, he said, tossing the card back with a flourish. But you understand that this does not grant you free passage anywhere. Thomas nodded once, minutely, almost imperceptibly. I understand, he replied. There was no challenge, no defiance in the tone, only calm. Mercer let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound intended to assert dominance, but faltering slightly as he regarded the old man. The group of Marines around him exchanged uncertain glances, sensing the unusual tension, the subtle shift in atmosphere that made the demonstration area feel suddenly smaller, more intimate, as if the world itself had slowed to focus on this quiet exchange. Mercer stepped back slightly, forcing a grin. Then perhaps you can explain something for us. What exactly is your background, sir? What have you done to warrant standing here in this open area with me and my Marines? Thomas's eyes followed the glint of sunlight on the rotor blades of the nearby aircraft, then back to Mercer, unflinching. I served, he said simply, the word carrying more weight than any uniform or medal ever could. Mercer's smile faltered. The young Marines shuffled uneasily. The simplicity of the answer, devoid of boast or explanation, created an odd tension, a quiet authority that contrasted with the captain's brashness. Mercer leaned slightly closer, lowering his voice again. Served where exactly? What branch? Thomas looked past him, surveying the orderly lines of equipment and personnel. In places that are long gone, he said softly. His voice was measured, deliberate, carrying decades of experience, yet leaving everything unsaid. Mercer blinked, momentarily thrown off balance by the calm that radiated from the older man. The crowd of onlookers had grown slightly, subtle murmurs rippling as people sensed the weight of the exchange. Mercer exhaled, forcing a laugh, and motioned toward the Marines standing behind him. Gentlemen, observe. This is how not to behave. Thomas remained still, unmoved, almost imperceptible in his reaction, the quiet presence contrasting sharply with the captain's restless energy. Each movement, each breath seemed to amplify his composure. Mercer glanced around, feeling a tension he could not shake. The visitor's attention had shifted. Some faces turned toward Thomas with curiosity, some with quiet admiration, others with confusion. The old man had not spoken again, and yet the impact of his calm, measured demeanor resonated across the small crowd. The young Marines began to exchange nervous looks, noticing for the first time the subtle power of restraint and presence. Mercer felt a flicker of uncertainty ripple through him. Something about Thomas Walker's stillness, his unwavering gaze, made the captain realize that the moment was no longer under his control. He was performing for an audience he did not entirely understand, and the quiet authority of the older man made that truth undeniable. The tension lingered, palpable in the air, as the warm afternoon sun highlighted the contrast between impatience and patience, arrogance and quiet strength, youthful confidence and decades of experience condensed into a single, unassuming figure seated on a folding chair. Captain Mercer shifted his weight, a slight edge creeping into his voice as he gestured toward Thomas Walker. Come on, old-timer, he said, the words carrying a mixture of mockery and impatience. Let us hear it. What was your call sign? Something quaint, I am sure. Something the instructors gave you back when you were just a kid in uniform. The young Marines behind him chuckled, their laughter echoing across the tarmac, blending with the distant hum of rotor blades from the parked helicopters. Thomas remained motionless, his gaze steady on the aircraft in front of him, unblinking, absorbing the scene without urgency. "Call sign?" he repeated quietly, his voice calm, carrying the weight of years without a single tremor. Mercer's smile widened. "Yes, sir. Your call sign. We always hear stories, right? Every Marine has one. Or did you forget yours already?" The remark drew a few more laughs from the audience of visitors and junior Marines, their attention fixed on the growing confrontation. Thomas finally lifted his head, meeting Mercer's eyes directly. The pale blue of his gaze held nothing but quiet clarity, and for a moment, the captain noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The warmth of the afternoon sun seemed to sharpen, highlighting the lines etched on Thomas's face, each wrinkle a testament to experience, discipline, and decades of service. Mercer's grin faltered slightly. He had expected hesitation, confusion, maybe even a fumble of words. Instead, Thomas leaned forward just enough to place his hands on the knees, steady and deliberate. "Iron Viper," he said, the words low but precise, almost like a whispered code, yet somehow cutting through the noise around them with undeniable authority. The Marines behind Mercer froze mid-laughter. The young men exchanged puzzled glances, sensing that something in that two-word phrase carried a significance far beyond their understanding. Mercer's brows furrowed. He had anticipated a joke, a meaningless phrase that would allow him to assert his control, yet these two words held weight, gravity that he had not accounted for. One of the more experienced Marines, stationed slightly further back, tightened his jaw and whispered under his breath, a frown crossing his weathered face, "That is not just a name." The faint rustle of nearby visitors shifting, the soft hum of distant helicopter rotors, and the occasional clatter of metal tools all seemed to recede, replaced by a tangible pause in the moment. Thomas Walker's calm presence dominated the space, a subtle but undeniable power that demanded acknowledgement without the need for noise or theatrics. Mercer's throat tightened, his next words caught between amusement and confusion. "Iron Viper," he repeated, almost as if testing the phrase on his own tongue. Thomas nodded once, minutely, maintaining eye contact without a hint of triumph or arrogance. The air around them felt heavier now. Even the younger Marines who had been laughing moments ago began to sense the weight of history and authority in the simple words. There was a pause, a collective intake of breath from the onlookers, as if the space itself were waiting for some signal, some recognition, and yet none came immediately. Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes, standing to the side, felt the shift first. His eyes narrowed, the lines on his face tightening as he recognized the significance, the resonance of a name he had only heard in brief, hushed accounts. Without speaking, he moved subtly, pulling a small communicator from his belt, fingers deft despite the warmth of the day. His gaze never left Thomas, noting the quiet composure, the deliberate stillness that belied the years of training, missions, and unseen accolades. The small act of communication set in motion a chain reaction, almost imperceptible to those not paying close attention, but to those who knew, it was the unmistakable stir of authority about to acknowledge what had been overlooked. Mercer, sensing something intangible but unable to articulate it, took a cautious step back, suddenly aware that the laughter and casual mockery had evaporated. The crowd had shifted focus, the air thickened with attention, and the calm, measured presence of Thomas Walker dominated the scene in a way that no one, including the captain, had anticipated. Every slight movement, every controlled breath from the older man, now seemed to carry weight, history, and an unspoken command of respect that filled the space around him, quietly asserting a truth that could not be ignored. The atmosphere shifted immediately after Thomas Walker spoke the words, "Iron Viper." The sun glinted off the rotor blades above, yet the hum of the machines seemed to fade, replaced by an almost tangible stillness. Captain Mercer blinked rapidly, as though trying to convince himself that the two words were no more than a clever quip from an old man. The Marines behind him exchanged uneasy glances, the earlier laughter completely gone, replaced by a quiet tension that they could not explain. Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes tightened his jaw, his fingers moving reflexively over the communicator on his belt. He had heard that call sign before, decades ago, whispered in briefings and passed along in stories from senior personnel. Now it hung in the air before him, solid and undeniable, carried by a man who appeared harmless at first glance. The older Marines nearest the edges of the gathering straightened subtly, their expressions betraying a recognition that others would not yet understand. Thomas Walker remained seated, calm, unflinching, his pale blue eyes surveying the assembled crowd, as if measuring the space, the attention, and the subtle shift of authority that had begun without any ceremony. The wind caught the hem of his jacket, but he did not move. The young visitors and families in the area sensed something in the air, a quiet but distinct authority radiating from the man, though they did not know why. Captain Mercer's grin faltered further. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert control, but no words came. There was a hesitation, a break in the rhythm of his usual confidence, and he sensed, vaguely but undeniably, that the balance of power had already tilted. The older Marines, veterans themselves, observed the moment with a mix of respect and silent acknowledgement, the years of service and experience in Thomas's posture and gaze making the difference clear. Daniel Hayes lifted the communicator to his mouth, speaking in a measured tone, concise and deliberate. Each word was chosen to relay urgency, without panic. The response on the other end came almost immediately, clipped, professional, and restrained, yet it carried the weight of recognition. Every listener felt it. The quiet command of authority, the weight of history, and the credibility embedded in the name, Iron Viper, had begun to manifest in reactions that were subtle but telling. Captain Mercer's eyes darted between Thomas and Gunny Hayes, the realization dawning that he was no longer in control of the narrative, that something far greater than his own authority was unfolding in front of him. The murmurs of visitors were suppressed automatically, as if they could feel the shift instinctively, knowing that what was being acknowledged silently required no explanation, no demonstration, and certainly no overt ceremony. Thomas Walker's calm remained unbroken. He did not raise his voice. He did not explain. The sheer presence, the measured patience, and the unspoken authority of his demeanor created a ripple that seemed to travel outward through the crowd, touching each observer with an almost imperceptible sense of weight, of consequence, and of history. Even Captain Mercer, standing now with a flush of uncertainty on his face, could not escape the impact. He had expected to command, to dominate, to assert. Instead, he was confronted with a quiet mastery, an understanding of gravity embedded in decades of service and silent observation. The air seemed to stretch, every footstep, every inhale, and every exhale heightened the attention to the old man, the call sign, and the unspoken story behind it. No one spoke. No one moved unnecessarily. The visitors felt the authority radiating from Thomas Walker, an authority that needed no words, no accolades, only recognition in the shift of behavior and the stillness of those who now observed him. The subtle nods, the tightened jaws, and the controlled exhalations created a rhythm, a cadence, in which Thomas's presence alone dictated the pace and tone of the moment, leaving all others to adjust in quiet acknowledgement, as though time itself had paused to honor what the words, Iron Viper, truly signified. The name, Iron Viper, lingered in the air, carrying with it an invisible weight that seemed to bend the attention of everyone present. The faint buzz of conversation from nearby visitors dissipated entirely, as if the world itself had shifted slightly, acknowledging a presence far older and more commanding than the young captain had anticipated. Thomas Walker remained seated, his hands folded lightly over his cane, his posture relaxed yet charged with the discipline of a lifetime of experience. The sun reflected off the surfaces of the parked aircraft, highlighting the subtle lines of age and resolve etched into his face, each wrinkle a quiet testament to decades of service, observation, and unwavering composure. Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes glanced toward the communicator in his hand, his jaw tightening, eyes narrowing as he transmitted a coded inquiry up the chain of command. Responses came quickly, clipped, and precise, each one more alert than the last, each recognizing the significance of the call sign without the need for explanation. Thomas's calm did not falter. He did not speak further, did not add to the tension, yet the magnitude of the two words had already reshaped the perception of the space around him. Captain Mercer shifted uneasily, his own voice caught somewhere between disbelief and the instinctive need to assert authority. The Marines behind him began to sense it as well, their previous laughter and casual demeanor replaced by a careful observation, an awareness that they were witnessing a presence that demanded acknowledgement without a word of explanation. Thomas's eyes followed a distant helicopter rotor as it slowed and then hovered, seemingly aware of the unspoken recognition emanating from the communicator chain. The afternoon light caught the faded insignias on his jacket, subtle markers of past service, almost invisible, yet carrying an authority that extended far beyond the immediate crowd. The young visitors had stopped moving, the faint rustle of clothing and footsteps muted in the sudden gravity of the scene. A faint exhale from the crowd, nearly imperceptible, marked their collective realization that the calm, deliberate composure of Thomas Walker was more powerful than any spoken authority in the area. Captain Mercer's lips parted, attempting to regain command, yet the words stuck. Every gesture Thomas made, every shift of weight, every blink, communicated an unspoken hierarchy, one earned through decades rather than asserted through youthful confidence. The silence was a testament to that history, reverberating subtly, yet unmistakably, through the small assembly. Gunny Hayes adjusted his posture, pressing slightly closer to the communicator, his expression unreadable but alert, noting the ripple effect Thomas had created, the recognition that stretched outward in all directions, unseen but palpable. The sun warmed the tarmac, the breeze played over the crowd, yet the focus remained on the seated veteran, whose stillness and quiet command of presence drew attention, respect, and a growing sense of anticipation. Each observer, from the youngest Marine to the family watching from the sidelines, felt the subtle, compelling pull of decades of expertise, a presence that required no explanation, no accolades, only acknowledgement. Thomas Walker's composure did not waver. The moment was complete in its quiet authority, a pause in the ordinary flow of the afternoon, drawing in every observer, bending perception, and creating a shared recognition that something extraordinary was unfolding in complete silence, heralded by nothing more than a name spoken once. Several hundred miles away, inside a climate-controlled operations center lined with screens and polished conference tables, a routine afternoon abruptly stopped moving in a routine way. A staff officer stared at the information that had just appeared on his monitor and read it twice to make certain he had not misunderstood it. The inquiry itself seemed harmless enough. A retired veteran attending a public event. A request for identity verification. A call sign entered into a secure system. Yet the response attached to that call sign was anything but ordinary. The officer sat up straighter. His fingers hovered above the keyboard before reaching for a secure phone instead. Back at the airfield, Thomas Walker remained seated beneath the warm Carolina sun. The crowd had grown larger. Visitors who had intended to spend only a few minutes near the aviation displays now lingered quietly, sensing that something important was unfolding. Captain Ryan Mercer noticed the subtle change. Marines who had been joking moments earlier now stood with unusual discipline. Conversations had become whispers. Even the atmosphere seemed different. It was as if everyone had received instructions except him. Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes lowered his communicator for a moment. His expression revealed nothing, but his eyes remained fixed on Thomas. A few seconds later, the communicator vibrated again. Another response. Then another. Hayes listened carefully without speaking. Each message seemed to deepen the seriousness of the situation. Somewhere else, another officer received the same inquiry. He frowned immediately. The name attached to the call sign triggered a memory from years earlier. Not a complete memory, just fragments. A briefing room. A photograph. A story told by a colonel who rarely spoke about the past. Within moments, another call was placed. Then another. A major contacted a colonel. The colonel interrupted a meeting. A brigadier general requested confirmation. Nobody seemed interested in discussing rank, retirement status, or paperwork. They all wanted the same thing. Verification. Absolute verification. The chain reaction accelerated. Captain Mercer folded his arms and attempted to project confidence, but uncertainty had begun creeping into his posture. He watched Hayes carefully. Marines did not become nervous without reason. Experienced Marines became nervous even less often. Yet there was something in Hayes's face now. Not fear. Respect. Serious respect. The kind that could not be ordered. The kind that had to be earned over decades. A warm breeze swept across the flight line, carrying the scent of jet fuel and sun-baked concrete. Thomas looked toward the distant runway. His expression never changed. He seemed completely detached from the growing attention surrounding him. That calmness bothered Mercer more than anything else. Most people became defensive when questioned. Most people explained themselves. Most people wanted recognition. Thomas wanted none of it. Meanwhile, in offices scattered across multiple commands, conversations became shorter and more urgent. Files were accessed. Old records were reviewed. Names were cross-referenced. One senior officer reportedly fell silent for nearly 10 seconds after hearing the call sign. Another reportedly stood up from his desk without saying a word. By the time the latest confirmation reached Daniel Hayes, the color had subtly drained from Captain Mercer's face. He still did not understand exactly what was happening. He only knew one thing. The old man sitting quietly in front of him was no longer being treated like an ordinary visitor. And somewhere high above the chain of command, somebody important had just started moving. The waiting became its own kind of pressure. No alarms sounded. No vehicles arrived with flashing lights. No dramatic announcement echoed across the base. Instead, the change revealed itself through small details that only experienced people noticed. A lieutenant standing near the operations tent suddenly received a call and immediately straightened. A senior chief from another section appeared at the edge of the crowd and remained there, watching quietly. Two officers who had been heading toward a demonstration changed direction entirely after checking their phones. One by one, pieces began moving across the installation like invisible dominoes falling in perfect sequence. Captain Ryan Mercer noticed every bit of it. The confidence he had worn so comfortably all afternoon now felt heavier. His folded arms slowly relaxed. His stance shifted. The certainty that had fueled his earlier remarks was being replaced by a question he could not answer. Why was everyone reacting this way to a quiet old man sitting on a folding chair? Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes received another message through his communicator. This time he did not immediately respond. He simply listened. The voice on the other end spoke for less than 20 seconds. When the transmission ended, Hayes lowered the device and stared at Thomas Walker for a long moment. The expression on his face was no longer curiosity. It was recognition. Nearby, a young Marine noticed the change and swallowed nervously. Nobody liked seeing a veteran non-commissioned officer look surprised. Hayes had spent decades around accomplished service members. Very little impressed him. Yet whatever he had just learned clearly mattered. The afternoon sun drifted lower, casting long shadows across the tarmac. Warm light reflected from aircraft canopies and polished metal surfaces. Families continued walking through the exhibits, but many now slowed as they passed. Word had begun spreading without anyone intentionally spreading it. People sensed significance long before they understood it. Thomas remained exactly as he had been from the beginning. Calm, patient, unmoved by attention. His eyes followed a transport aircraft crossing the distant horizon. The sight seemed to pull him somewhere far away for a moment. Not physically, mentally, as though he was looking beyond the base, beyond the crowd, beyond the years themselves. Then his focus returned to the present. Meanwhile, inside command offices across multiple levels of authority, conversations became increasingly unusual. A colonel interrupted a briefing. A brigadier general requested immediate confirmation from archival records. A senior aide reportedly asked the same question 3 separate times because he could not believe the answer. The responses never changed. Every verification led to the same conclusion. Every record pointed to the same man. Back on the flight line, Captain Mercer finally approached Hayes. His voice was lower now, more careful. "Gunny, what exactly is going on?" Hayes looked at him briefly. The silence lasted several seconds. "Sir," he said quietly, "I think people much higher than us are about to answer that question." Mercer felt a chill despite the heat. Before he could respond, another communication arrived. Hayes listened. His posture immediately changed. Not dramatically, just enough for every Marine nearby to notice. The seasoned gunnery sergeant stood straighter. His shoulders squared. His expression sharpened. When the message ended, he took a slow breath and looked toward the main access road leading into the base. Several heads turned in the same direction. Nothing was visible yet, only sunlight shimmering above distant pavement. But something was coming. Everyone could feel it now. And for the first time since this entire encounter had begun, Captain Ryan Mercer realized he was no longer waiting for an explanation. He was waiting for someone important enough to provide one. The distant hum of an approaching vehicle grew louder, slicing through the quiet tension that had settled over the aviation display. Thomas Walker remained seated, his pale blue eyes tracing the movements of visitors and young Marines alike, but his posture did not change. Captain Mercer shifted slightly, the warmth of the sun on his back doing nothing to ease the sudden tightness in his chest. Every instinct he had relied upon for command seemed muted, replaced by the subtle realization that the hierarchy of authority around him had shifted without ceremony. Gunny Sergeant Daniel Hayes adjusted the communicator on his belt, speaking in a quiet, controlled tone, receiving a confirmation that was immediate and precise. The vehicle came into view now, moving slowly, deliberately, its polished surfaces catching the sunlight. It carried the unmistakable presence of someone whose authority did not require explanation. The crowd around the display instinctively parted, sensing a change without understanding its nature. Thomas did not move. He did not rise or acknowledge the vehicle. He simply remained, a quiet anchor amidst the growing anticipation. Captain Mercer, now aware that whatever was approaching carried weight far beyond his understanding, swallowed hard. His hands clenched briefly at his sides. The Marines behind him mirrored his unease in subtle ways, shoulders tensing, eyes shifting toward the road. The vehicle stopped a short distance away. A door opened, and a figure stepped out, uniform impeccable, presence commanding. Lieutenant General Robert Kane had arrived. His eyes swept across the scene with deliberate precision, noting the gathered Marines, the visitors, and finally, Thomas Walker. The veteran remained seated, a calm, unassuming figure, yet the general's gaze lingered, acknowledging a history and a legacy that needed no explanation. Mercer felt his posture weaken slightly, the weight of unspoken authority pressing down. He opened his mouth, searching for words, for something that could reassert his control, but none came. General Kane approached slowly, each step deliberate, measured, creating an almost imperceptible cadence that reverberated across the tarmac. The onlookers sensed it instantly. Children stopped mid-step. Families froze with coffee cups in hand. Even the distant rotors seemed to hesitate, as if aware of the gravity now present in the space. The general reached Thomas Walker and paused. He looked down at the veteran, eyes reflecting years of respect, understanding, and recognition. Thomas inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the presence without disturbance, without ceremony. Mercer could not help but watch, realizing fully that the balance of power, the definition of command, and the perception of authority had all shifted. The general extended a hand briefly, a subtle gesture that carried decades of recognition and honor, and then offered a crisp salute. Thomas Walker returned it, precise and understated. The entire area, every Marine, visitor, and family member, felt the moment, understood it in silent agreement. The unspoken message was clear. This man commanded respect by presence alone, history alone, and the quiet authority of experience. Captain Mercer stood rigid, the realization of what he had underestimated settling like a weight he could not lift. The wind stirred the edges of jackets and hair, but no one moved unnecessarily. The quiet acknowledgement stretched across the tarmac, felt in the subtle tension in shoulders and the slow, respectful breathing of those who had witnessed it. No one spoke. No one applauded. The respect was silent, absolute, unquestioned. The simple, measured exchange between Thomas Walker and Lieutenant General Kane communicated more than any words could have, asserting an authority born not of ceremony, but of decades of service, quiet heroism, and unwavering composure. Captain Ryan Mercer remained frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing against him with a force he had never encountered. His hands were at his sides, stiff, as if gripping invisible reins that would not respond. Thomas Walker lowered his head slightly, eyes meeting the general's in a brief acknowledgement, a silent conversation passing between two men who understood more in a glance than any briefing or document could convey. The rest of the crowd, including the assembled Marines, visitors, and staff, held their breath, the air itself seeming to still in respect. The sun had begun its descent, casting long golden streaks across the tarmac, highlighting every detail. The folds of Thomas's jacket, the polished surfaces of the aircraft, the faint lines of tension in Mercer's face. Lieutenant General Kane nodded once, subtly, a gesture heavy with recognition, approval, and gratitude, and without a word, turned to address the assembled personnel. His presence alone commanded attention, yet he did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The acknowledgement of Thomas Walker's decades of service, the quiet heroism that had been unseen by most, was complete in that gesture, understood by all who could read it. Captain Mercer swallowed, his throat dry. The earlier amusement, the mockery, the confidence, all evaporated under the weight of unspoken respect. He took a slow step back, the crispness of his uniform doing nothing to ease the sudden self-consciousness. The Marines around him mirrored his stance, a chain reaction of recognition spreading quietly through their ranks. Thomas remained seated, hands resting lightly on his cane, his posture unaltered by the acknowledgement, unaffected by the attention, as if it had never been about approval, accolades, or recognition at all. The simplicity of his presence, the quiet strength, and the composed demeanor created an atmosphere that no one dared disturb. A light breeze stirred, carrying the distant hum of rotors, the faint scent of engine oil, and the warmth of late afternoon sun. Visitors shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the ordinary rules of observation had changed. Every movement of Thomas Walker now seemed to hold weight, every glance carried authority, and every silence was laden with significance. Captain Mercer's eyes flicked briefly to Daniel Hayes, whose face remained stoic but whose eyes conveyed a message: respect, earned and deserved, needed no further explanation. Mercer finally exhaled slowly, a sound barely audible, as the tension in his shoulders loosened fractionally. Thomas's gaze drifted over the crowd, landing briefly on a young visitor holding a model aircraft. The faintest smile appeared, subtle, private, unspoken, a recognition of the world continuing around him even as the gravity of the moment held its place. Lieutenant General Kane stepped back, allowing the acknowledgement to resonate, the silence to stretch and linger. There was no fanfare, no applause, no proclamation. Only the shared understanding of a presence that could not be ignored, a lifetime of service condensed into one seated, composed figure whose quiet authority left an indelible mark on everyone present. Captain Mercer finally nodded, a slow, deliberate motion that carried humility he had not known he possessed a moment earlier. The lesson was clear. True respect requires no words. It only requires recognition, observation, and an understanding of what has been earned over time. The afternoon continued, but the tarmac had changed. Every observer, every Marine, every visitor now carried a subtle awareness that some moments, some people, demand reverence simply by existing, quietly, steadfastly, and with the weight of history behind them.